Well, everyone, good evening and welcome to the 32nd annual Alice G. Smith Lecture. So we're here at the University of South Florida School of Information. Before we discuss the lecturees and the honorees for tonight, the lectures, I want to first give you a brief background on the Alice G. Smith Lecture. So the lecture was established in 1989. It has been sponsored by the University of South Florida School of Information and has been held in annual recognition of a scholar or author whose achievements have been instrumental in the development of librarianship or information studies. The lecture series honors the memory of our school's first director, Alice Gullen Smith, known for her work with youth in bibliotherapy. The lecture fund was created with the purpose of memorializing the visionary work of Dr. Smith, who was central to the School of First Accreditation by the American Library Association in 1975. Florida Library Association archivist Bernadette Stork also has provided an oral history of the development of libraries in Tampa that details contributions of Dr. Smith, including her establishment of the Tampa Book Fair that encouraged thousands of children to foster a love for books and reading. So here are some of our past lectures. One of them includes our former iSchool director, Dr. Jim Andrews, LIS scholar and educator, Dr. John Budd in 2009, creator of librarian.net, Ms. Jessamine West in 2019, author and illustrator of children's books, Mr. Ashley Bryan in 2007, and author and storyteller Jane Yolen in 1989. This year, I have the pleasure and honor of presenting Ms. Lucia M. Gonzalez and Ms. Alicia K. Long, who will be presenting the lecture entitled Changing the Face of Librarianship, Reforma and Library Services to Latino Communities. Ms. Alicia K. Long is a bilingual librarian, educator, and scholar. She is an adjunct instructor at the University of South Florida School of Information and Access Services Supervisor at the State College of Florida, Manatee Sarasota Libraries. Alicia teaches in multicultural materials for children and young adults as the USF School of Information graduate program, and in 2021, she published Developing an Impactful Diverse Literature course for future librarians. Ms. Lucia M. Gonzalez started her career in library services to children in 1988 after receiving her master's in library and information science from the University of South Florida. Since then, Gonzalez has worked in different capacities for the Miami-Dade Public Library System, including program-wide coordinator, including system-wide programs coordinator. She was associate director for Broward County Libraries in charge of outreach, family literacy, and youth services before coming to the city of North Miami. Gonzalez is currently City of North Miami Library Director. She is the author of 3 award-winning children's books. The Bossy Gallito, winner of the 1996 Pura Belpré Children's Literature Honor Medal and part of the New York Public Library's 100 picture book Everyone Should Know. Señor Cat's Romance and Other Favorite Stories from Latin America, an Américas Award Commended Title, and the Storyteller's Candle La Velita de los Cuentos, winner of 2009 Pura Belpré Children's Literature Honor Medal for Narrative, the Jane Addams Children's Book Award, Honor Book, and the Américas Award. Today's lecture will cover REFORMA and library services to Latino communities. REFORMA holds a special place in our heart, especially for me as being a member of REFORMA. For those of you who may not know, REFORMA is the National Association to promote library and information services to Latinos and the Spanish-speaking, an organization that Ms. Long and Ms. Gonzalez have been actively involved for many years. Ms. Long in 2021 and 2022, the current year, she is the current president of REFORMA de la Florida chapter, the National Association to Promote Library and Information Service to Latinos. She also has chaired REFORMA's Public Relations Committee and the Pura Belpré Award Selection Committee. Alicia is currently the chairperson of the Walter Dean Myers Award Judging Committee from We Need Diverse Books. Alicia was the 2012 American Library Association ALA Emerging Leader for Reforma, where she developed the Noche de Cuentos website, and she has also an ALA Spectrum scholar.
Yeah.
Ms. Gonzalez is also a past president of Reforma, the National Association to Promote Library and Information Services to Latinos and Spanish speaking from 2010 to 2011. National Chair of Reforma's Children and Young Adult Services Committee from 2006 to 2010. Two-time recipient of National Library Journal Movers and Shaker Award for her contributions in shaping the future of libraries, and 2021-2022 president of the Association for Library Services to Children, ALSC, a division of the American Library Association. For tonight's lecture, if you have any questions, I ask that you please load those to the end. Our student organization of Library and Information Science, also known as SOLIS, our president, Maria Feliciano, who is also a member of Reforma, will be hosting the Q&A for this evening. So please save your questions for that portion. And now, without further ado, I present you with this year's Alice G. Smith Lecture honorees, Ms. Lucia M. Gonzalez and Ms. Alicia K. Long.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. Good evening, buenas noches, buenas tardes a todos. It is such an honor and such a pleasure for me to be here tonight as an alumna of the USF School of Library and Information Science, class of 1991, at the time still part of the College of Education. I am immensely grateful, estoy muy agradecida to the USF School of Information Faculty and Administration for selecting us to be part of the esteemed and prestigious Alice G. Smith Lecture Series. My special thanks to Dr. Kathleen de la Peña McCook for her activism and continuous dedication to the advancement of library services to Latino communities, and for her scholarly research and her contributions to the body of work that defines Latino librarianship. Tonight, we're going to tell you a story in two voices, with Reforma as the protagonist of the story. First, we will each, Alicia and I, tell you how we became reformistas. Then, alternatively, we will try to condense, to summarize 50 years of the history of the organization in 1 hour. I joined Reforma in 1988 while I was still in my first class in library school with Dr. Henrietta Smith. And that's one of the first things that I learned from Dr. Henrietta Smith, that if you want to be heard, you need to participate and you need to be there where everything is happening. She encouraged us to join, and I learned about Reforma in her class. In 1989, I attended as a student my first ALA conference, and the first thing that was in my mind was to look for the Reformista librarians. As a student, I saw them as radical librarians, and I wanted to find them. In their name, in the name Reforma, implicit in that name, I saw a call to action, a call to change from within, a call to transform and to reshape the organization. For me, attending that meeting was a political act. On the third evening of a conference, it was Reforma's membership meeting. I met there my good friend, Sandra Rios Valderrama. She may not remember. And Oralia Garza de Cortez. They were at that first membership meeting of REFORMA for me. And one or the other introduced me to a lot of the people that were there. At that meeting, I met Ingrid Betancourt, that year's national president. I met past presidents Susan Luevano and Elena Chesney. There was Joan Ayala, Martin Gomez, Al Milo, Elizabeth Martinez, and Dr. Arnulfo Trejo. As a new student, little did I know of the prominence of the reformistas that I was meeting that night. They were the heartbeat of Reforma, the activists, the scholars, the practitioners committed to changing the face of librarianship. That's how I became a reformista. For many of us, Reforma provided a training ground for leadership skills. For me, it provided a forum for networking and discussing, an important platform for my voice, for our voices to be heard, and from where I could lead the conversation about library services to Latinos and the Spanish speaking. I have since been a life member of Reforma.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Lucia. I want to thank Dr. Vanessa Reyes for the introduction. Thank you very much. And I especially want to thank the University of South Florida School of Information, its faculty and administrators for inviting me and Lucia to give this presentation today. It's a great honor. And I'm going to tell you that as I'm originally from Argentina, and as a Latin American, it is a pleasure to me to be talking today about an organization that represents Latino Americans in this country, and an organization that, as Lucia said, is here to produce change, to reform, and to radicalize what librarianship looks like for 50 years and counting, and for many more. So it is my privilege to be celebrating REFORMA today. I got my master's in library and information science at USF here. And I joined as an adult after I came to the United States. And since I became an ALA Spectrum Scholar, the School of Information allowed me to get a graduate assistantship when I was a student in the school. I was so fortunate to be assigned as a graduate assistant to Dr. Kathleen de la Peña McCook, who you will hear mentioned many more times throughout our presentation today. So you will see that she has a history with Latino library services to Latinos. And of course, one of the first things she did was making sure that I joined REFORMA. So that as a student was my introduction to REFORMA. In 2010, as the Spectrum Scholar, I was able to attend my first ALA conference in DC. And that is when I joined the REFORMA meetings. I went to my first Pura Belpré celebration. If you don't know what it is, find out. And I was hooked. From then on, I signed in to volunteer at every event, and I became involved with the organization. So I've been a member since then. I've been involved in different aspects, like the introduction says, so I'm not gonna explain more about that, but the rest is history, as they say. And so let's talk a little bit about history, and let's start this little time travel that we prepared for you. So if everybody is ready, we're going to take you on a quick trip to through the decades of the 50 years of REFORMA. So let's move on. Lucia? You're muted, Lucia.
1970 was the first year when I came to the United States. I was just 12 years old. I was not a reformista yet, of course. But let me tell you what was going on with Reforma at the time. In a speech delivered at the 1968 Arizona State Library Association Convention in Tucson and published in the September 1969 issue of the ALA Bulletin, Dr. Arnulfo Trejo addressed a question asked of him many, many times. The question was, and a question from well-meaning librarians, as he said, how can I make my library more meaningful to the Spanish-speaking people? In his answer, Dr. Trejo addressed the difficulty of not really knowing who are the Spanish-speaking people. Not knowing who we are, he said, it becomes easy to lump various national groups under one lump or one designation. His answer to that question has been intrinsic to the narrative of the past 50 years, I believe. Distinctive to the Latino community is that the Latino community is always transitioning, is always rebirthing. It is always expanding in numbers as well as geographically. At the onset of Reforma in 1971, there were three major groups. The Mexican Americans in the West, Southwest, the Puerto Ricans in the Northeast, the Atlantic coast, and the Cubans in Florida. A lot was said about the difference between the three groups, but I look at the similarities. In 1970, the Mexican Americans in the West and the Puerto Ricans in the East shared one common experience. For generations, the Mexican Americans and the Puerto Rican communities experienced marginalization and oppression. Both had relinquished their language and their culture. Both were treated as second-class citizens, outsiders. Their common fight was about reclaiming language, about reclaiming the culture that went with that language and that had been taken away from them. The Cubans, on the other hand, we were the new immigrants, the newcomers, the new Americans. And we, as newcomers, struggled to preserve the language and the culture that was still intact, that we brought with us, while trying to assimilate in the new land. The fact is that in 1970, or today, the Latino community is a dynamic community characterized by change, diversity, renovation, and expansion. Library services to the Spanish-speaking has a long history that precedes the establishment of Reforma. We can go as far back as the 1920s and 30s and the pioneering work of Pura Belpré at New York Public Library, who was talking about the importance of outreach services and of providing library programs, services, collections in the language of the community. Or Lillian Lopez, leading in the 1960s the South Bronx Project. Or a very young librarian in the West Coast named Elizabeth Martinez, the first and only Chicana librarian working in the library in East LA in 1970, and who, with librarian Jose Taylor and others, formed a group called the Committee to Recruit Mexican American Librarians. The late 60s and the 70s was a time of political activism, of social change. The Chicano movement in the West, El Movimiento, or the Puerto Ricans and the New York, El Comité, proclaiming their rights and reclaiming their heritage. I cannot tell you about the history of Reforma if I don't tell you about one poem, one that was later made into a film, a very well-known Chicano film. The name of the poem and the film is I Am Joaquin. I am just going to read the last few verses. La raza, mexicano, español, Latino, Chicano, or whatever I call myself. I look the same, I feel the same, I cry and sing the same. I am the masses of my people and refuse to be absorbed. I am Joaquin. The odds are great, but my spirit is strong, my faith unbreakable, my blood is pure. I am Aztec prince and Christian Christ. I shall endure. I will endure. I am Joaquin. To that I say, the Latinos, we are the conquered and the conquerors. We are the indigenous and the Europeans. We are the slaves and the masters. We're Asia and Africa. That's who we are, the Latinos. That's who we've always been. In her recently published book, A Jaguar at the Library, the story of the first Chicana librarian, Elizabeth Martinez tells us that at her first ALA conference, she carried a 16mm copy of the Chicano film I Am Joaquin, looking for an audience to show it. And the story goes, it's all about story, that it was then when she met Dr. Arnulfo Trejo from Tucson, and he agreed to show the film at one of the meetings that he was conducting. He was deeply moved by the message of the film. It was then and there that Reforma was born at the 1971 ALA conference in Dallas, Texas, to pursue the ideal of reforming the profession, of reforming libraries' lack of services and lack of outreach to the Spanish-speaking people, and to create positive change in the level of quality services to our communities. According to the story and the documentation, there were only a handful of librarians, of Latino librarians, attending the conference at the time. Among them were Esperanza Costa, Emma Morales Gonzalez, Alicia Iglesias, Modena Martin, Maria Mata, William Ramirez, and Dr. Arnulfo Trejos. Reforma, from its beginning, aimed for social change, to change the library's peripheral treatment of the Latino community to an inclusive, responsive, and respectful attitude. The West and East Coast librarians came together at ALA. The ALA conferences provided a great venue for meetings of the West and East and the Southwest. It was there where recruitment took place, where the dialogue started. And that is why becoming an affiliate of the ALA, of the American Library Association in 1975, was such a significant event. It was very important. Becoming an affiliate opened many doors for Reforma leaders to take on leadership roles within ALA at all levels of the organization, effecting thus change from within. But the greatest of all achievements during this decade was the creation of two graduate institutes that together graduated more than 100 librarians trained to meet the special needs of the Latino communities. From 1972 to 1975, there was the Mexican American Library Training Institute at Cal State Fullerton under the leadership efforts of Elizabeth Martinez and Jose Taylor and Jonah Ayala and others. And from 1976 to 1980, the Graduate Library Institute for Spanish-Speaking Librarians, known as GLISA, founded by Dr. Arnulfo Trejo, REFORMA's first president from 1971 to 74. National leaders such as Martín Gómez, Luis Herreras, and Liz Rodriguez Miller are alumni of these institutes. Personally, I met many librarians at the Miami-Dade Public Library System in the late 70s that were able to get their degrees thanks to GLISA. There were scholarly articles and significant publications during this time. Among them, I want to mention one that became a very special tool for me, and that was Dr. Isabel Chon's Books in Spanish for Children and Young Adults, an annotated guide, Libros Infantiles y Juveniles en Español, una guía anotada. It was first published in 1978. That book became the authority, the Bible, for librarians selecting books in Spanish for their Spanish communities, for their Latino communities. Whether you spoke Spanish or not, the reviews were in both languages. It was an excellent tool. By the end of the 1970s, and as we prepared to enter the new decade, REFORMA was well positioned as an important and recognized national network. Alicia.
And we enter the new decade with REFORMA poised to become this movement and influence. And the 1980s presented an opportunity for REFORMA to shine for different factors. One of them was a geographical factor. It just happened that ALA had planned its 1981 annual conference in San Francisco, California, and its 1983 annual conference in Los Angeles, California. So the fact that it was these two annual conferences were taking place in a state that had strong chapters of the new REFORMA was influential in the number of REFORMA members who were able to attend ALA annual for the first time, and also the members who started becoming more involved, joining the organization, doing presentations for annual conference, applying to be elected to ALA Council, and many other opportunities that were brought to the state of California. An important event that happened during that conference was that the National Commission of Libraries and Information Science, they had a task force on cultural minorities in the libraries. And they held a hearing during the 1981 annual conference. This hearing was chaired by none other than E.J. Josie from the Black Caucus of ALA, and several people from REFORMA spoke in the hearings, were invited, and they made statements that are recorded in that document about the needs of library services to Latinos and the Spanish-speaking. In addition, there were presentations in that conference. There was a colloquium that was organized by REFORMA along with the Chicano library collections of the University of California at Berkeley, Los Angeles, and Santa Barbara campuses. It was a joint presentation about Chicano collections. Later, that same presentation will be joined by the Black Caucus and expand into an even bigger colloquium. In addition, in the 1983 conference, something began, which was a tour of libraries serving Latino communities. As part of the ALA, the guests were invited to go on a tour of libraries where they were demonstrating what services they were providing to the Latino community in particular. And that tour became also a regular event that happened in many conferences after that. Then another situation that prepared REFORMA for action during the 80s had to do with an external factor. And by external, I mean external to librarianship and more related to the status of society. Around the mid-80s, there was as you may remember or know, those of you who remember, a push for what became known as the English-only movement. The English-only movement was intended to have the US Constitution and the constitutions of the states to have language specifically stating that English is the official language of the land. Of course, REFORMA members and librarians opposed this measure, as well as many around the country and at ALA as well. For obvious reasons, our libraries serve the community, and a measure like this will impact the library services, its publications, the language spoken by the staff or by people in the libraries, the collection development. So there was a big movement of opposition to the English-only movement, and REFORMA took leadership again, and REFORMA's leaders were instrumental in getting, first they got a position on language rights statement issued by REFORMA that is still in REFORMA's website today. That position became as the statement regarding language rights. And then that influenced ALA. So it was taken to ALA Council, and in 1985, ALA approved a statement to be released advocating for language rights in all of our libraries. In that statement, it's also part of ALA's policy manual up until now. Some of the states sadly managed to pass the bills making English only the official language of the state, but several library associations, state library associations, also joined with these statements and opposed the movement. Also, in 1985, something happened in REFORMA internally. Susan Luevano was elected the president, and that means she was the first woman president of REFORMA. And as Lucia just told you, women were part of REFORMA's birth with Elizabeth Martinez and the other ladies that she just mentioned. And they were leaders, women leaders in REFORMA throughout the years. However, this is the first time that a woman became the president. So it's an important milestone. Another influential thing that REFORMA members did those years was to become part of a team with the Reference User Association of ALA, RUSA. Now it's called RUSA. It used to be called RASD because it was the reference division before. But anyway, it's the association that addresses topics in reference services. And they created this team to develop what is called the Guidelines for Library Services to the Spanish-speaking. That was huge. That was a very important document that helped many librarians and public libraries all over the country who needed guidance on how to provide better services to their Latino populations. So again, REFORMA members were seen as the experts and were invited to collaborate in this document that has been a reference for public librarians or for librarians throughout the years. That document was updated later in 2006, and it's also still available as a resource for librarians in the ALA website. There were some publications in the 80s as well, and you start seeing, we've been going through some of the book covers, and so that you get to see some landmark publications. Salvador Guerenia again published one of It's many volumes of Latino librarianship handbooks. Camila Alire and Orlando Archibeque published the first edition of Serving Latino Communities, a how-to manual. And then there were other publications. And so with that, we enter into the 90s, which was the publication boom. And I'm going to be passing out to Lucia to share a little bit more about the 1990s and starting with the publications.
Yeah, I think the 1990s was, I like to call it a powerful and prolific decade. It was, I think, it's the most important decade. So many things were born in the 1990s. But starting with the publication of Latino Librarianship, I think I have the book here somewhere. That book became a classic because first of the diverse background of all the contributors, uh, because of the extensive bibliography that was in it, and because of the well-developed index. It was a very, very invaluable resource for scholars, for practitioners, and it was the go-to book for consultation. Uh, at the time, that was when I was just starting my career. I graduated in 1991, and so believe me, that was my book, and I have it with me in my office and everywhere. It's a treasure for me. It's never outdated. Um, Now, it is no surprise, of course, that in 1992, the first Loti Award. Now, I call it the Loti con cariño. It is the Librarian of the Year, Reforma Librarian of the Year Award. It is the Arnulfo Trejo Reforma of the Year Award. It's been so since its beginning. First, it was established by Dr. Arnulfo Trejo and funded by Hispanic Books Distributors, of which Dr. Trejo was the founder and president. And so Salvador was the first Loti, the first librarian of the year. The Loti is still given, as I said, to this day. And I just want to give you the lineup of names of winners of Loti in the 1990s. Starting with Salvador Guereña, Luis Herrera, Mario Gonzalez, Héctor Hernández and Al Milo, Lilian Castillo, Camila Alire, Ramiro Salazar, Ben Ocon. What a lineup. They were the who's who of Latino librarianship. 1992 also saw the birth of the Trejo Foster Foundation. The primary reason for the creation of the Trejo Foster Foundation was to address issues related to library education. And the greatest legacy of the Foster Foundation, among its key initiatives, was the establishment and sponsorship of the Trejo Foster Foundation National Institutes. There were 4 in the 1990s. In 1991, it was the status of Hispanic Library and Information Science, a National Institute for Education Change at the University of Arizona, Tucson. In 1995, it was Latino Populations and the Public Library, University of Texas, Austin. 1997, it was Hispanic Leadership in Libraries at Rutgers University, School of Communications in New Jersey. And the 4th one was, in 1999, Library Services to Youth Services of Hispanic Heritage. I was there I was there as a participant, as a presenter. And of course, the organizer was Dr. Kathleen de la Peña McCook and others from the university. It was a great event. I recall when I walked into the space and I saw all the exhibitors of Spanish books. There was Linda Goodman from Bilingual Publications. There was Teresa Mlauer from Lectorum. There was Dr. Trejo and his Hispanic books distributors. Books with Wings from San Francisco. Libros Sin Fronteras. There were so many books. So many vendors dedicated to books in Spanish. That was very characteristic of the 1990s. Books in Spanish for adult and for children, and librarians and libraries developing Spanish collections had a boom in the 1990s. These names that I read to you, like Books with Wings and Libros Sin Fronteras and all those, they don't exist anymore today. But they were very important in the development of collections at the time. And then, 1996, if I was to write a book about famous firsts, I would start for REFORMA with 1996. First, Pura Belpré Award Celebración. The first Pura Belpré medal was given at the American Library Association conference first, and then the Celebración, the medals were presented at the first REFORMA National Conference in Austin, Texas. I was there. And I had the joy of being one of the awardees. My book, Bossy Gallito, won the Pura Belpré Honor Medal that first year in 1996. And in front of me, in the audience, was then Executive Director of ALA, Elizabeth Martinez. That was, the people in the audience, it was the who's who of ALA and all the ethnic caucus. They were there because it was so important, that first Pura Belpré celebración, that first Pura Belpré award, that first REFORMA National Conference. I think documentation tells me it was well attended. It was about 500 people attending. It was quite a gathering. And then in 1996, that was when REFORMA became the home of DIA, Día de los Niños, Día de los Libros. Pat Mora brought it. Oralia Garza de Cortés received it, cherished it, and grew it. And REFORMA chapters everywhere adopted DIA celebrations. It was a grassroots movement that became more and more popular, to the point that eventually it made it to the bigger house, to ALA, to be celebrated by communities everywhere. Those were big firsts in 1996. Moving on. 1997, the ALA, oh my God, the 90s, ALA Spectrum Scholarship, the most significant and long-lasting initiative effectively contributing to changing the face of librarianship. Elizabeth Martinez at the helm of ALA, Dr. McCook's scholarly research, and Sandra Rios Valderrama leading ALA Office of Diversity. It did not take a village. It took a familia for the Spectrum Scholarship Initiative. I want to close this decade with what I call a broche de oro. In 1999, as part of the Trejo Institute, the Alice G. Smith Lecture was given by Isabel Chong. The name of her lecture, and I was there, and Alicia was there, was From Doña Blanca to Don Quixote. And Isabel Chong was introduced by Dr. Arnulfo Trejo. And that wraps up the highlights of my 1990s.
And we start with that because, as Lucia just explained, that Trejo Institute in 1999 was published, or most of the papers, including the text of the Alice G. Smith lecture by Isabel Shawn from Doña Blanca, Doña Blanca to Don Quixote. That text, along with the other presentations on that Trejo Institute, were compiled and published by Dr. Kathleen de la Peña McCook and Barbara M. Roth. And that is Library Services to Youth of Hispanic Heritage, another landmark publication that we all have in our shelves too. But continuing with this influx of publications from the 90s, the early 2000s also saw a flurry of research and publications being published. Salvador Guarenia again published Library Services to Latinos, an anthology, another landmark reference book for that time. And then the Library Trends issue number 49, which has become cited in many papers and scholarship, was a special issue that Dr. Kathleen de la Peña McCook edited for Library Trends, a journal from the University of Illinois. And it was a special issue dedicated to the topic of ethnic diversity in libraries and information science. So every paper in that issue, every article is a clue, is key to understand the status of diversity and librarianship. It includes a piece by Salvador Guarenia again and Edward Erazo, and it also includes an article by Sandra Rios Valderrama. So there were contributions in that publication, but there's more. The first book about the Pura Belpré Awards, edited by Ros Certuche Trevino, was published in the 2000s also. Serving Latino Communities is the second edition of the previous one we showed you before by Camila Alire. This time she co-edited with Jacqueline Anchala. That was published in 2007. Salvador Avila also published a crash course in serving Spanish speakers. So all of these landmark publications happened throughout this decade. And then going back to Isabel Shawn, as Lucia mentioned, Isabel Shawn published several volumes before now that were bibliographies and book and recommendations, compilations of reviews of books in Spanish for children and youth. In 2003, she published The Best of Latino Heritage, and she was the go-to for collection development on Spanish books for children. Now, if we talk about collection development in general, it's very important the existence of Críticas, which was a magazine of book reviews that existed throughout the decade, from 2001 until around 2010. Críticas published reviews of Spanish language titles, and these reviews, and many REFORMA members were contributors. Several of the people we keep mentioning, Lucia was a contributor, other people, Freda Mosquera in Florida, and many other reformistas were contributors of reviews to Críticas, which was a very important tool for of Spanish titles. Then we talk about events. So Lucia mentioned the first REFORMA National Conference. So from now on, we call them RNCs to keep adding acronyms, right? So RNCs are the REFORMA National Conferences that took place throughout the years at different intervals of time in between. But the second one took place in the year 2000 in Tucson, Arizona. And Lillian Castillo Speed published the proceedings of selected papers from the conference into The Power of Language and Poder de la Palabra. RNC3 happened in 2008, and that one was in El Paso, so it was on the border, an important conference in El Paso, Texas. And Lucia wanted to make sure that we mentioned that the first Noche de Cuentos took place in that conference. So Noche de Cuentos, if you don't know, is a night of storytelling that takes place since then in most of national conferences. We always try to have a Noche de Cuentos event with famous storytellers and a lot of stories and entertainment for everybody attending the conferences. So the first Noche de Cuentos happened at the border at RNC3 in El Paso. And you can see Lucia there with her Perez and Martina puppets, right, in the picture. More events, more Trejo Institutes. Again, the Trejo Foster Foundation organized these institutes for research and academic analysis of the library services to Latinos, and each institute had a different topic or theme. During this decade, they had the Trejo Institute 5 in Wisconsin, Madison, I think, 6 in UCLA, and 7 in Arizona. The 7th one also saw the proceedings published. It was a topic of health and Latino services, so it was Salud Se Puede, the title, and the proceedings were published by the Trejo Foster Foundation, which at that time was led by Dr. Trejo's widow, Ninfa Trejo, who you can see in the photo in a REFORMA event. Another big event. So this was a first that was very important. For the first time, what it was called the 5 ethnic associations, that's what they called it at the time, which means the Black Caucus of ALA, the American Indian Library Association, the Chinese American Librarians Association, and the Asian Pacific American Library Association, plus REFORMA. Those 5 associations decided to host a conference together, and that was the first joint conference of librarians of color, which from now on we will say JCLC to again use acronyms and shorten the titles. So the first JCLC took place in Dallas, Texas in 2006. And the program of the conference is very interesting. It has sessions about all kinds of topics and again, we're talking about 5 different ethnicities here. So imagine the breadth and the richness of the programs. But I just highlighted a few that I recognize, the names of some of the presenters from here, from USF School of Information, like Dr. Gregory, Dr. Alexander. There was a program about Hispanics in Central Florida that was presented at that conference. And then there was an opportunity to meet Dr. Henrietta Smith and Samuel Morrison, 2 of our Florida representatives as well. So that was JCLC 1. We're kind of getting close to the 2000s decade. And this decade ended with a bang with 2 very important events. The first was that Camila Alire was elected to be the 2009-2010 ALA president. This means this was the first person of Latino heritage to be president of the American Library Association. The first time ever in all of ALA's history. Camila Alicia was, again, to start in 2009. And then in 2010, Lucia was elected to be REFORMA's president. You can see her president's program that was at the end when she culminated her year in New Orleans, her president's program, which had a keynote by Dr. Kathleen de la Peña McCook. So this like kind of closes the decade with all of these events. And as I mentioned before, this is when I started in Reforma. So look how I started. So this brings us to the 2010s.
And so Alicia comes in 2010, and I remember meeting Alicia in the early years of Reforma and saying, wow, this is a promising member. Yep. Camila Lire, I have to say, she was past president of Reforma. And yeah, that's very important. She brought us, she brought all the ethnic caucuses together, and she reached out to us, and she wanted us to be part of her presidency. And one of the the outcome of it was, of course, was the Family Literacy Initiative, Camila Lire's Family Literacy Initiative. That was the start of Noche de Cuentos. Noche de Cuentos, remember, we have Dia in the 90s. Dia grows up and goes on to ALA Ask and becomes national and so on. Still our baby. And then we have Noche, which is another family literacy initiative. It's centering around the power of stories to unite communities. Literacy, especially in our communities, starts with stories, with storytelling, with our oral traditions and customs, the musics, the poetry, the rhymes, the nanas. All that is so important to maintaining culture. So, in a way, Dia is about the written word, about the books, the children and their books. Noche is about the oral traditions and how important it is as the basic of our inheritance, cultural inheritance. Noche took a life of its own, and still many grants are given to this day for Noche de Cuentos events. And at national conferences and RNCs, there's always a Noche de Cuentos showcasing the work of local performers and storytellers to national audiences, and also bringing in guest storytellers from Latin America to tell their stories at this national forum. 2010-2011 was my year as president. And I say it was the transformative decade. It was the year, 2010-2011, of the 8th Trejo Institute, the publication of John Ayala's and Salvador Guereña's Pathways to Progress, and in September of 2011 was RNC4 in Denver, Colorado. It made history. RNC4, there were so many attendees at RNC4. It was organized, the co-chairs were Ramiro Salazar and Orlando Archibeque. It was held at the home, in Denver, the home of Camila Alides. And what a trio. That conference, I can remember the gala. I can remember the celebrations. Everything about that conference was magical. And of course, the 40th anniversary gala. Maria Kramer was president of Reforma at the time. I left the presidency that summer. Maria Kramer was the president during RNC4. My president's program in the summer The theme was reigniting and passing the torch. It was seeking the new generation of Reforma leaders, a call to the new generation of Reforma scholars. And of course, Dr. McCook delivered the keynote. But as I was talking about the gala in RNC4, I have to also mention that one Reforma tradition, very important tradition, is the Reforma fundraisers for scholarships. The scholarship started in the 90s, maybe the 80s. I should study that. I should research that. But throughout the 90s, the highlight of the conference was always the Reforma fundraiser for the scholarship. People from everywhere came to the Reforma fundraisers. You could see the leadership from ALA, from everybody came together, and we all ended up dancing. And it was the best way. It's always the best way to network. The Reforma fundraisers. At that time, 2010, 2011, Reforma's membership reached a peak. But no matter how many members we had, no matter how many librarians graduated, we could never keep up with the growing numbers in our communities. It seems like every 10 years, we doubled the community. You know, we went from 30 million to 40 million to 50-some million. And it's just impossible to keep up. Significant gains were made during this time, partly the result of programs like, as I mentioned, the Reforma Scholarship, the Spectrum Initiative, and the Emergent Leaders Program. Alicia was an emergent leader. Latin America, during this time, was suffering, and the children in Latin America were suffering, and they were coming to seek relief. They were coming to seek asylum. In 2014, the national media placed a spotlight on a national crisis: the growing number of unaccompanied minors detained at the border. They were our children, and Reforma took action. In 2014, Reforma established the Children in Crisis Task Force. The task force created the Children in Crisis Project that seek donations to purchase books for the hundreds of unaccompanied minors arriving at the border. If we could at least alleviate the pain of a child, give him some comfort, what better way than providing him with a book to start that journey? Silvia Cisnero was Reforma president. Oralia Garza de Cortez, Patrick Sullivan, and myself kickstarted the project that attracted funding partners such as IBI, the International Book Board for Youth. Reformistas, librarians mobilized to visit shelters, detention centers, group homes, you named it. We went everywhere across the country to deliver not only books, but also story times and library services to refugee children. The Children in Crisis Project succeeded because it was embraced by the Reforma chapters and their members. And that is what makes Reforma strong. Since the 1990s, the 80s, there have been fluctuating numbers of chapters, sometimes 15, sometimes 16, sometimes up to 20. Sometimes some chapters become dormant, sometimes others form, and then others revitalize. Reforma in its structure, and because of the chapters, is a grassroots organization. The chapters operate independently. and support regional efforts, scholarships, awards. Each chapter is an expression of the diversity of the Latino communities and the Latino librarians in each region. Each region is representative of its population. Well, there's a lot of information that remains to be covered in this decade. But as my good friend Sandra Rios Valderrama told me, it's not just about the numbers, it's not just about the statistics, it's also about the story. It's always about the story. It's about the narrative. And so I want to wrap up this decade first with the conference that never was, RNC 6. It was a historic event. Why? Because for the first time, a Reforma National Conference was going to be held outside continental USA. Reformistas, it was going to be read in San Juan, Puerto Rico. Reformistas from the mainland, from everywhere, joined the very strong chapter, Reforma chapter in Puerto Rico to coordinate and organize the event. At the time, I was co-chair of the programs committee, and there were, I can say, over 100 proposals submitted. But what was characteristic of the proposals of these programs is that at least half of them were going to be presentations in Spanish. Now, 1 week before the event, when many of the leadership of Reforma was already in the island, Hurricane Irma hit, and RNC 6 never happened. But the next year, and this is very important, a daughter of Puerto Rico and Reforma past president, Loida Garcia Febo, became the second Latina to be elected as president of the American Library Association. And that is closing the decade con un broche de oro, I would say. Little did we know what was coming. Little did we know what we were to discover in 2020. But I let Alicia talk about that.
Before that, I want to say that in 2019, it was also the elections that elected Lucia Gonzalez as the first president of ASC, the Association of Service to Children, the first Latina person to Latinx person to be president of this division of ALA. So starts in 2020 with Lucia as president of that division on services for children. So that brings us to 2021 and what's happening now. So we are this year celebrating the 50th anniversary. So this is the reason why we're talking today. And Reforma planned its 7th RNC to take place in occasion of the 50th anniversary. It was supposed to happen in Portland, Oregon, but another major event changed plans, and due to the COVID pandemic, the RNC 7 took place virtually. But don't let that fool you. It was a full conference with many programs, from a variety of sessions, keynote speakers, social events, a noche de cuentos, a gala, even a game of loteria, everything done virtually. So the conference used a virtual platform and app, and that allows for interaction. It was a very interactive conference. It was just not just the presentations, but also a lot of participation from the members. The gala that took place, of course, was the celebration of the 50th anniversary. So it was emceed by the comedian Marga Gomez, and It included the Mariachi Arcoiris Band and many other presentations, including the launch of a video in commemoration of the 50th anniversary, Reforma's legacy, the first 50 years. The conference also had two pre-conferences, one on leadership and women, presented by Loida Garcia Febo, among others. And another one was Dia y Noche, which included a showcase of a lot of programs that took place for both the Dia program and Noche de Cuentos. And it's all available online for attendees, which, like I said, it was very interactive. The conference app and website had a lot of opportunities for social networking, from meetups to networking sessions, discussion forums. And believe me, if I say this, and maybe Lucia already mentioned it, Reforma's conferences are very interactive in person. And so online was not an exception. You wouldn't tell that this was an online conference because interaction happened a lot in the apps. The conversations were long and active, and people shared everything from photos of the altares they did for Dia de los Muertos, to articles, to book covers, to recipes. Everything went into the forums, and so it was a very, very interactive conference in celebration of the 50th anniversary. Also, it was a celebration of the 25th anniversary of the Pura Belpré Award. And so during the conference, there was a video presentation of a celebration of the Pura Belpré's 25 years, which included an event in New York, in Harlem, the home neighborhood of Pura Belpré, where there was a presentation of books to children, and then that was shown in a video that was shown also during the conference. So RSC 7 was a celebration, and 738 attendees participated in the virtual conference. Which brings us to now. Where are we now? We just celebrated the 50th anniversary. Thank you for coming along this 50th trip that we just did. But now where are we? So I know we've been discussing a lot, and we wanted to give you a very quick snapshot of numbers to reflect on these things. So when we started talking about Dr. Trejo and Elizabeth Martinez and the first founders of Reforma, and throughout the years, you notice that one of the goals, the most important goal, was to change the face of librarianship. And I mean the faces of librarianship, right? So recruitment and getting more librarians of Latino heritage is one of the goals that keeps happening. So let's look at some numbers, shall we? First of all, ALA, the latest demographic study made by ALA looking into diversity, the latest one was diversity counts, and that was 10 years ago. So maybe we're due for a new one. That was based on the 2010 census. In that diversity counts, there were 3,661 librarians of Latino heritage out of 118,666, which is 3%. This was 10 years ago. The population, according to the census, was 16.3% Hispanic, but 3% of librarians. Of course, there are many studies, and I'm going to just go quickly through these. There were some studies done by Dr. McCook and other scholars, Denise Atkins, Isabel Espinal, many people who did studies about diversity and librarianship and what needs to happen and who makes the grade and where are the minority librarians, and all of those studies that happened throughout the years. This year in 2021, Dr. McCook and Dr. Yoon did a study based on ALICE reports. ALICE is the Association for Library Information Science Educators. And it says that 7.83% of the graduates, people graduating with a librarian degree, are of Hispanic heritage. Now, the population is 18.7 now. So 783 versus 18.7. Now, 7.83 is more than the 3%, right? So we're improving, but here we are. Let's talk about Florida. So according to, oops, I clicked twice. According to the census, the 2020 census, Florida is now 26.5% Latino or Hispanic population. So yay, more than a quarter of the population, we are here. So what are our numbers in our libraries and in our schools? So I picked out the numbers for USF, and of the students in the USF program in 2020 and 2021, there's a 13.7% of students who are Hispanic or Latino. And Maria here in this audience leading the Q&A is an example. So 13.7%. Not bad, USF. Could we do better? Probably. So that is the conversation that we want to leave you with, and is this discussion of where are the challenges and where is our role to reform now. We talked about REFORMA being this movement to change things, to make things happen, right? So we have these three areas that we focus in the presentation today that REFORMA and other leaders always focus on, which is the recruitment of more librarians of Latino origin or Spanish-speaking, diversity and librarianship, right? Then we have leadership. So not only we need more librarians, but we need those librarians to become leaders. We need them to make things happen, to bring this change that we've been talking about. And for that, the librarians need to be part of the organizations. So hello, join REFORMA. REFORMA Florida has a chapter. No, that's my commercial. So we need more leaders in the associations, signing up for ALA, joining ALA Council. That's where things happen, and nominating themselves, reaching positions of leadership, and making change happen. And then the third leg of the, or third part of this wheel is the research and the publications. And you saw that there was a period of time in the 90s and early 2000s that were a lot of publications happening, and then it kind of got stagnant a little bit. So who is publishing now? Who's going to be the next, who are going to be the next faces in the next slideshow that we present at another anniversary? We need the leaders, we need the scholars, we need the librarians to bring change to our library services for the benefit of our Latino communities, but for everybody, as we know, that diversity enriches everyone. So the RNC 7 this year, the conference, the theme was "We are the change, somos el cambio." 50 years later of an organization called REFORMA. So this brings back the circle to this intentional purpose of making change happen and what needs to happen in librarianship. So we have a lot of opportunities to grow and opportunities to do more research and more studies to see what needs to happen. And we are welcome to hear your thoughts and to join us in this adventure of bringing better and more services to Latinos and the Spanish speaking. Oh, I forgot to mention one thing. Talking about change, and like Lucia said, library services to Latinos are ever changing. They're never the same. They evolve. Things are different now than they were in the 60s, right? We adapt to the changes. REFORMA did children in crisis when that happened, and other things that sprouted out of the needs of the moment. Things change constantly. One other thing that's changing recently is the decisions of what terms to use to refer to Latinos. So throughout this presentation, I want to clarify that we use the word Latinos to make it consistent, because we didn't want to go back and forth between different terms, and especially because we were referring to REFORMA, which is the National Association to Promote Library Information Services to Latinos and the Spanish speaking. So keeping in line with REFORMA's official name, we decided to use the term Latinos. But as you know, there are other words that could be used, and maybe it's time also to bring some change if needed. And we could have used Latinx or Latinx, which is more inclusive, or in the Spanish language, they use the ending e, Latine, which ends in e, but is pronounced e in Spanish, as a way to move away from the binary Latino, Latina, feminine and masculine. So I just wanted to clarify that the reason we use the term Latinos was to keep in line with REFORMA's official name, but that's another point of discussion. So I think this wraps up. I don't know, Lucia, if you want to add something else, or we can move on to the questions.
I just want to add to the the fact that we call ourselves Latinos. It's whatever we call ourselves, because right now we're telling our story and we are defining. The term Hispanics was given to us. This whatever was given, but not anymore. I think we're in a position now where we tell our story and we define however we're going to be called. Like, yo soy Joaquín, I am Joaquín, Mexicano, Español, Latino, Chicano, or whatever I call myself, right? Questions?
Hi, everyone. Before we do questions, I just want to briefly interrupt and remind everyone that this lecture is being recorded and will be published on our various digital media platforms. Please, if your camera is on, turn it off. We respectfully request that you turn your camera off. If you don't know if your camera is on, please check the icons at the top of your screen. I see there are a couple people who may have their cameras on. With that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it back over to our lecture team. But thank you very much. Please remember, this is still being recorded. Thank you.
And now I present to you our SOLAS president, Maria Feliciano, who will be handling the Q&A session. Thank you, Maria, and welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. And Lucia and Alicia, your presentation was incredible. Just seeing all of the history that REFORMA has and the richness is really inspiring as a student who is currently at USF getting her master's in library science degree. I will be checking out the chat. If anyone has any questions, feel free to throw them in there. I will be reading them out on your behalf. In the meantime, we do have some questions for Lucia and Alicia, and either of you can answer however you'd like. But our first question we have is, how has working with REFORMA enriched your career and or personal life?
I can take that. And Alicia, you can also chime in. To me, REFORMA has shaped me professionally. I don't think I would be president of ALSC were it not for REFORMA. I came to REFORMA. I took charge of my profession. I became active nationally. I was able to have a voice from a platform and contribute to the larger dialogue and the larger conversation, precisely because I had in back of me, I had REFORMA. So for example, I I co-chair the Children and Young Adult Services Committee of Reforma. And as part of that, I started my conversation with ALSC and my activities with ALSC, and look where I am today. So I think it has been, for me, very important.
I'm going to add that for me, in my career, I have a broad type of involvement in different jobs, and Reforma is the common denominator in a lot of ways, because I do work with academic libraries, I do work with children's services and book award committees and diversity in the library profession. And in all of these different areas of my career and my different jobs and projects and things that I become involved, they always come together in Reforma, because Reforma has brought to me the contacts, the networking with these wonderful leaders. I mean, these names that I mentioned today are all people that I admire and that I know that now I have access to. And they inspire me, they give me information, they are my go-to scholars and the people that I trust to get whatever information I need for the different aspects of my career. So that's kind of how it works for me. And Maria, if you don't mind, I want to answer a question in the chat that John asked, if it's all right to submit questions. What would you want to see non-Latinx librarians do to support Reforma and the Latinx community? Would you want non-Latinx librarians to join Reforma as a member, or would that take away from the Latinx Center focused on Reforma? And I want to say something very important that we forgot to say. To join Reforma, you don't have to be Latinx, and you don't have to be a librarian. You have to want or be interested in services to Latinx in the libraries, library services to Latinos. So if you work with the Latino community in your library, you may want to join, you definitely need to join Reforma, because that's where we're going to discuss services to Latinos. But you don't have to be Latinx. And you don't have to be a librarian. You can be a library worker. You can be a library assistant. You can be a specialist. You can work in a cultural institution that is not a library, but this type of services are helpful. And a lot of our chapters have members of the community who work in all kinds of grassroots organizations and nonprofits, and that their goals align with Reforma's goals, and so they're welcome too. So no, you don't have to, please come on board.
Thank you so much for answering both of those questions. We have another question from Stephen. He says, some cultures, including Spanish speaking and others, rely more on oral storytelling as opposed to written storytelling. Do you feel that this difference in the presentation mode of stories affects the desire and promotion of librarianship amongst different Spanish speaking communities?
Lucia, I'm going to let you answer that because I know you have something to say.
Well, I think, the presentation of story is important. And, if you're not a Spanish-speaking member of a community, there is a way in which you can learn the community's story and present the stories in an authentic and respectful way. But you need to get immersed in the stories of the community, whether you speak the language or not, but you do need to learn the storylines and respect those stories, and always try to listen to the community and serve. For example, I work in a community that's not Spanish speaking. My community is from Haiti, and I have been able to transfer all the skills that I learned and all the things that I brought with me as a bilingual, because I'm bilingual, but I don't speak Creole, but I'm bicultural. But I'm not from Haiti, but I have that experience in me. And my goal is to learn their story. And from my bicultural, bilingual experience, try to listen to their story and bring them into telling, having them telling their story.
Thank you so much for answering. We have another question. This is, of course, for the students, because I know there are some here along with myself. What advice do you have for graduate students and or recent graduates regarding entering the workforce and wanting to promote and develop diversity in their work spheres?
Okay. I don't know if Lucia, you wanted to say
Maria,
something?
can you repeat the question?
Yes, absolutely. And I'm sorry if you missed it that first time. What advice do you have for graduate students and recent graduates regarding entering the workforce and wanting to promote and develop diversity in their own work spheres?
If you're entering the workforce and promoting diversity from, first, are you part of a diverse group? So it all depends. You always promote diversity by your attitude and your training and how you approach your environment and your working your working environment. So you promote diversity with your personal acts, with how you relate to the workplace, and how you may be in an environment which is not diverse, and then you happen to be the only one person of color in that environment. So you start by creating awareness, by speaking about diversity and bringing that awareness to your coworkers, and hopefully influencing the decision makers in the organization. Because if you are just coming into the workplace, it's hard to make change at that time. But with the conversation, you start with the conversation. You start with creating awareness, and hopefully through that you can influence the decision makers, and eventually you yourself become a decision maker.
And I'm going to add to that. I agree with that. And also be prepared to listen. Come with a listening ear and pay attention to what people from different groups, ethnicities, identities, or backgrounds are saying. Don't ignore them, and don't react if they're telling you that something you're doing is affecting their perspectives. Be open to listen and respect and learn more about what other people are experiencing. And that's the key in any kind of situation. And I always, I'm going to extrapolate this metaphor that we bring from the children's literature, right, plugging in my little area here. So in children's literature, we have this wonderful metaphor created by Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop about the mirrors, the windows, mirrors, and sliding doors. And it's talking about books acting as mirrors, windows, and sliding doors for the reader. But I'm going to bring that into library services, into your career as new graduates. Bring that perspective on wanting to have services where people can see themselves, services and opportunities to see a window to other people, and sliding doors to step out and meet them where they are and go into other people's lives and get that perspective from being there with them. So I'm stealing from Dr. Bishop the metaphor and applying it to this for new graduates, I guess.
Thank you both for your answer. It's really enlightening. We have another question. As someone who works on the administrative side with LIS programs, what are some ways that we as a department can encourage younger generations in your community to engage in librarianship and show the importance of the field? And that's from David.
I think that outreach is the key. Get out there, get into the community, go to the high schools, go to the to the community colleges, to the undergraduate programs, showcase the librarianship, the librarian profession. We have to sell the profession. We have to promote the profession. And a lot of times, people don't know. It's just a matter of not knowing. So outreach, outreach, outreach.
She said it.
Thank you. I think we have time for a few more questions. I'd like to quote Lucia just for a second. It's going to be paraphrased. You're speaking goes in line with the question. So you mentioned Henrietta Smith, who met us at USF, are aware of or have heard of. You mentioned her telling me once, if you want to be heard, you participate. You see there where everything is. Could you talk more on the other figures from your past that have inspired you in your life? And again, this is a question for both of you.
Maria, can you please repeat that? It's cutting off a bit.
It's cutting off, yeah.
The entire question, did you hear any of it? Okay. Am I speaking clearly now? Is it cutting out now?
Now you are.
Now, clearly. My apologies. I'm sure it's confusing to answer a question you can only hear nothing of. I first wanted to, I first mentioned your quote about Dr. Smith.
Maria, we still can't hear you. Maybe you can type the question in the box for us.
Does anybody else have a question that you would like to? You can even unmute yourself and ask in the meantime, I suppose.
Or enter the question on the chat.
How are we with time, Vanessa?
We have a few minutes left before the end of the hour. Okay. So yes, so we're good, doing well. Okay, here we have the question. Lucia, you mentioned your work with Dr. Henrietta Smith. Are there any influential figures from your past that have inspired you in your life and career?
The greatest inspiration in my career has always been Dr. Henrietta Smith. From storytelling, from my activism in the profession, she shaped my vision in librarianship, and she made it clear that if I wanted to exert change, I needed to drive change. That was Dr. Henrietta Smith. I admire her so much to the point that my Ask Presidents program, and Alicia is co-chairing the coordination of the Presidents program, will be dedicated to Dr. Henrietta Smith, because she did not just inspire me, but so many other people in the profession, not just in children's librarianship, but in the profession at large. She's my number one hero.
And this question was also for Alicia as well. Are there any influential figures from your past that have inspired you in your life and career?
Well, from the career, as I mentioned at the beginning, Dr. Kathleen de la Peña McCook has been my Henrietta Smith. Like what Henrietta did for Lucia, Kathleen did for me. So Dr. Kathleen McCook has been inspiring me since I was a student and even after that. And not only she helped me network and get in touch with the people who make things happen and with the organizations and different groups, but she's also always pushing me to do more, to do research, to publish. I've been doing a lot of publishing and research and other types of projects inspired by her example. So that's one. And then the people I just mentioned from Reforma, here they are. Lucia is one of my inspiration person in Reforma. Sandra Rios Valderrama, Oralia Gaza de Cortez, who the two of them I got to meet thanks to my work with Pura Belpré Award. And they are the founders, and so they are my leaders and source of inspiration too. I did have other inspirational people in my life, of course, before librarianship and even in Argentina, where I started my career as a school librarian, and I had a very great professor there too. But here in the U.S., I think the people in Reforma and Dr. McCook are probably the most influential ones.
I see there was a question from John Clark about the Haitian community. The question is, are there organizations like Reforma dedicated to library services for speakers of Haitian Creole or other communities, or are principles that Reforma has used which could be used to support those communities? As far as I know, there are no organizations like Reforma of Haitian librarians. I think that there's a lot of work that needs to be done to recruit new librarians from the Haitian community, especially bilingual and bicultural. It's a community that is continuously growing, and there's a great need for professionals to come in and serve that community. I do recommend EMERT, which is the Ethnic Materials and Information Exchange Roundtable from ALA. You know, that's what they do. Also, the American, the Asian Pacific Association, Library Association of HALA, and then the Chinese American Library Association, and all the ethnic caucuses. We all have principles and services that can be applied to diverse communities, of course. And so that's good that, you know, you can explore all the ethnic caucuses and their programs and services. But again, I do hope to see more librarians graduating that are Haitian American librarians that speak Creole. And Florida, and probably they will start having an association at FLA.
And if you're in Florida, join Reforma Florida, and we can expand a little bit to include Haitians into our discussions. I'm making that on the spot.
Yeah, as I said, what I learned from my training serving the bilingual bicultural communities, the Spanish-speaking communities, I have transferred. It's like the skill of reading. You transfer those skills to working with the new communities.
Thank you for sharing. Can everyone hear me okay now? Am I cutting out at all? Well, glad that everyone was able to step in and do the work for me. We do have another question for you, the both of you. It's clear that Reforma has been absolutely instrumental in providing inclusive and necessary work for the Latino and Spanish-speaking community. What would library and information services look like if this kind of inclusivity, diversity was more accepted and encouraged, and who would benefit?
Alicia, you want to start?
So repeat the last part. What would, can you repeat the question, the end? I got the beginning.
Okay, as long as I didn't cut out. What would library and information services look like if diversity was more accepted and encouraged, and who would benefit?
Okay. Well, that's a goal, right? I think if in an ideal world, if diversity had the role that it has to be, maybe organizations like REFORMA wouldn't be needed, because the ALA association would represent everybody. And I'm not advocating for not needing REFORMA, of course. We always need REFORMA. But what I'm saying is that all of the associations that are about specific groups, all of the awards that are about special groups and populations and ethnicities or different experiences were born of being excluded. So throughout history, librarianship has very, very wide, and this generated all these movements. So if librarianship and library services really embrace diversity, then that will mean that there wouldn't have to be special efforts for every particular group, but we will all be working for the same goals, including everybody and the representation of all the voices, which is always the goal, right? Have our voices heard. So a world with diversity in it in libraries will mean where every voice is heard and where every voice can act and can result in action and in change, and there's no difference of importance on where it's coming from. So I think that will be the goal. We, again, like we said, we need diversity and leadership. We need diversity and the people doing the work and the people who publish and the people who do the research studies, and at all levels.
I think that diversity in the profession is very important in making libraries a prominent part of all communities' lives. Because when you walk into a library and there are people that you can communicate with, number one, people that understand the needs for information that you have. When you walk into a library that has the feel and look that makes you feel welcome, that understands that which makes you feel welcome. And that can only be achieved through diverse staff, diverse workers, diverse library workers, diverse professionals. You know, how am I going to develop a collection? The best way would be for me to be in tune with the community that I'm developing that collection for. And why not get librarians from that community to be, to work at the library, to lead the library. And I think diversity generates diversity. When we're talking about hiring, usually, and it's a natural thing, you tend to hire someone that talks like you, that looks like you, and you don't venture outside of your comfort zones. So the more diverse the profession comes, the more we go up as people of color, go up into leadership positions. Also, the more we're going to be reaching out and bringing up people of color into leadership positions. So it's all together.
It's wonderful. Thank you so much for answering, both of you. I think we have time for at least one more question before we leave for tonight. And I wanted to ask, this one's from me. I wanted to ask, where do the both of you hope to see REFORMA in the future, in the next 5 years or 10 years, or even after that? What would your dream of REFORMA be? We took this time to discuss REFORMA's history, and again, how rich it is, how much the librarians of the past have really moved us forward, I think, as a society, if you think about it. But how would you like to see the future of REFORMA pan out?
I want to see REFORMA continue to grow. I want to see REFORMA continue to have a leading voice when it comes to library services to Latinos. I want to see REFORMA continue supporting new professionals in different ways. And I want to see new institutes. I want to see REFORMA working together with academic programs that cater to the needs of forming Latino librarians, professionals in the field of library services to Latinos, and that address the information needs of Latino communities. I want to see REFORMA's influence in that grow, and more young leaders in the profession join REFORMA to move it forward.
I think she said it best. I don't have much to add to that. One thing that I like about REFORMA is its own diversity, because as we mentioned in the history, it started with a group of Chicano librarians, but REFORMA is so broad now, and we have members from all parts of the world, and from the diverse Latin American countries and origins. The current president is from Argentina for the first time. So we have Argentinians and people from Puerto Rico and Cuba and Mexico, which are the big three, but then we have El Salvador and Honduras and Guatemala and all of these other cultures in Colombia, and I don't want to hear from those that I'm leaving, but Peru and leaving behind. But the diversity in REFORMA has been growing throughout the years. For what I gather from the people in leadership roles, I always check what their origins are, and it's still growing, and I would like that to keep happening, because the Latino population is this huge umbrella and it involves a lot of people. I also like the diversity in REFORMA with intersectionalism and people from different groups and different backgrounds and different ages, and new and old, and the leaders along the young students working together for those goals that Lucia was saying. REFORMA being at the center of services to communities, which is our main goal, to be embedded in the communities that we serve, and to take action as needed to get those communities engaged and pursuing their development, which is what libraries do, right? So.
I want to thank you both again for so graciously answering the questions and for allowing me to lead this question and answer session. As a member of REFORMA and also a current student at USF, it means a lot to be given this opportunity. So thank you very much.
And a special thank you to Lucia and Alicia for their wonderful presentation, Maria for hosting this great Q&A, and I'm going to leave it open to Dr. Cannon for closing up our event. And it has been an honor to serve as the host, I would assume, running the session. As a Latina, as a woman of Cuban descent, I am honored to be able to do this, and as an instructor here at the School of Information, thank you for this grand honor to be able to present these champions for librarianship in Spanish-speaking communities.
Great, thank you, everyone. This was a wonderful event, and if we haven't done it enough already, I think we should again recognize our event chair, Dr. Kathleen McCook, who worked tirelessly to put this together. And if you didn't notice, this was a different format tonight, having two speakers at the same time on a virtual platform, and it worked out wonderfully. This was great. If you are watching this and you'd like to see this again, we will post this on our website. It'll be at the same location, our event page, and we'll also distribute it soon on social medias. If you're not watching it, then you don't know that. But we will send it out on social media. And so everyone has an opportunity to not only watch this, but to watch it again. And I assume to this wonderful piece of history, to cite it widely in discussions and references. So we'll bring tonight's session to a close and thank everyone. And we'll see you at the next virtual conference or the face-to-face conference. Good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.